The wind rolled low across the plains of whispering pines, stirring the tall grass like whispers in a church pew. The year was 1887, and the world beyond this rugged corner of Montana felt distant, as if time itself had chosen to sleep under the big skies. Horses kicked dust outside saloons. Coal trains howled in the distance like ghosts chasing tracks. This was a place for tough men, closed hearts, and few second chances. On the outer edge of town, past the dry creek bed and over a lonely hill, stood a worn-out ranch with warped fences and a wide, sagging porch. It belonged to Luke Rollins, a cowboy whose name was often spoken in town, but rarely in conversation with the man himself. Luke wasn't the kind who courted attention. He preferred the saddle to supper tables and the sound of hooves to human voices. Luke had once been more than a shadow. Years back, folks said he was headed for a state senate seat. Clean boots, soft-spoken charm, and a fiancée who brought light wherever she walked. But war and fire have a way of stripping a man to bone. He came back from the Civil War quieter. Then came the fire that took his bride-to-be, and what remained of his spirit was buried with her. Since then, he had lived with only his cattle, his dog, and the stubborn rhythm of ranch life to keep him anchored. The people of Whispering Pines tolerated him. Some respected him, others pitied him, but none truly knew him. Not the man who still sat alone on his porch every sundown, fingers brushing the faded letters of love he kept folded in his coat pocket. It was during the Spring Thaw Festival, a time of rowdy celebration and poor decisions, that the town's cruelty revealed itself. The saloon was packed. Laughter spilled out onto the boardwalk, loud and unfiltered. Behind the bar, Sheriff Cole Madden, Luke's only real friend, watched with a growing unease as a group of young ranchers clustered in a corner, whispering and smirking. Among them was Jed Keller, a landowner's arrogant son, with more bark than brains. "You really think he'll take her in?" Jed laughed, his breath sour with whiskey. "He's lonely as a dry well." Someone else muttered, "Bet he'd marry a scarecrow if it had a pretty face." A small wagon stood outside, carrying a woman, barely 25, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes vacant and limbs unmoving. Her name was Clara. No one cared to ask where she'd come from or what tragedy had placed her in that cart. They'd pooled coins to purchase her services from a traveling group. No more than a cruel joke wrapped in skin and silence. "She's your wedding present, Rollins," Jed shouted the next day, when they wheeled the cart up to Luke's ranch under the glare of morning sun. "Figured you needed a wife more than a horse." Luke stood barefoot on his porch, a mug of black coffee in hand, the steam ghosting into the air. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in something deeper, something colder. He said nothing as the cart was placed at the edge of his porch. The men laughed, slapped each other's backs, and waited for the outburst. But none came. Luke stepped off the porch, boots crunching the gravel, and approached the cart. Clara turned her face slightly, her gaze meeting his. There was no fear in her eyes, just a weary sort of defiance, like someone who had long stopped expecting kindness. Luke crouched down, hat pressed to his chest. "What's your name, miss?" Silence. He nodded once, slowly. "All right, then." He glanced at the men. "You boys done now?" Their laughter faltered. "You can leave her here," Luke said flatly. "But she ain't a joke. Not to me." The men rode off awkwardly, kicking up dust in their retreat. Luke lifted Clara gently, careful, deliberate, and carried her inside the house. Her body was stiff, legs unmoving beneath the patchwork blanket. She weighed so little it worried him. Inside, he laid her on the cot in the corner room, where the light came in soft through linen curtains. He fetched warm water, brewed tea, and placed a modest plate of bread and honey beside her. Still, she said nothing. That evening, Luke sat on the porch, sharpening his knife against a whetstone. The sun dipped below the horizon, smearing the sky in pinks and oranges. Behind him, he heard a soft rustle. Clara, propped against the doorframe in her cart, eyes steady. "You didn't send me away," she said, voice hoarse as dry timber. "No, ma'am," Luke said without looking. "Why?" He paused, the knife stilled in his hands. "Because I don't throw people away. Not even when the world tells me I should." She looked away, shame coloring her face. "Wasn't my choice to come here," she murmured. "Wasn't mine to make you stay," he replied. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful, even solemn, like two graveside mourners sharing unspoken pain. Clara turned her cart back toward the room. Before she wheeled away, she said, "My name's Clara. Clara Whitmore." Luke nodded once, and when she disappeared into the house, he whispered her name aloud, like a prayer. That night, he lit a second lantern in the window, just in case she woke and was afraid of the dark. Mornings came early on the Rollins ranch. Long before the sun had finished rising, Luke was already in the corral, feeding the horses and checking the fencing that had suffered through another long winter. His movements were practiced, almost mechanical. Until now, ranching had been his language, his prayer, and his shield. But this spring was different. Now there was Clara. From her place by the window, she watched Luke work. At first, her gaze was skeptical, guarded, like a fox that had spent too long caught in traps. But as the days passed, that watchfulness softened into curiosity. Inside the house, Clara remained mostly still. Her legs, paralyzed from the waist down, offered no hope of walking. She hadn't tried to explain it yet, and Luke hadn't asked. He didn't need details to treat her with respect. What she did have was her mind, sharp, perceptive, and humming with buried dignity. Luke, true to his quiet nature, did not hover. He made room. He built a ramp without comment. He adjusted the table height so she could reach it. He brought her books from town, an act he thought unremarkable, but which stunned Clara into silence. On the fourth morning, she finally spoke more than a sentence. Her voice was thin, like parchment folding. "I was a schoolteacher," she said, turning the pages of a worn novel. "Before all this." Luke didn't pause his work at the stove. He nodded, his back still turned. "Figures," he said. "You talk like someone who used to make kids mind their verbs." She cracked a smile, small, reluctant. "And you talk like someone who hasn't been in a classroom since Noah built his ark." He chuckled, and that chuckle warmed the kitchen more than the fire did. In town, however, tongues wagged harder than ever. At the general store, Mrs. Langley whispered loud enough for 3 aisles to hear. "Took in a crippled girl, they say. Just let her sit there like a flower pot." The barber shop offered no sanctuary either. Reckon Rollins finally snapped. One man drawled, "What's next?" "Marrying a scarecrow." Sheriff Cole Madden, ever watchful, heard it all but said little. He had known Luke since boyhood, knew what lay behind the stoic eyes and stitched up silences. Luke had seen enough death for 2 lifetimes. Maybe now he was finally choosing life. Still, gossip in a town like Whispering Pines was like prairie fire, impossible to contain once lit. Back at the ranch, Clara was testing herself in small, silent ways. She learned how to maneuver around the house in the chair Luke had customized from an old wagon seat. She insisted on helping in the kitchen, peeling potatoes, mixing herbs, even organizing the pantry shelves alphabetically. One evening, she asked Luke to bring her outside. "I haven't smelled real dirt in months," she said. "That kind of thing gets to a person." Luke carried her carefully and set her near the paddock. The horses whinnied softly, sensing her unfamiliar presence. She stretched out her arms, inhaling deeply as the wind wrapped around her like an old friend. "They're beautiful," she said. Luke nodded. "They're stubborn mostly. That one there, Bluebell, she kicked me clean into the fence once." Clara laughed, surprised by the image. "Maybe she didn't like your tone." "Wouldn't be the first woman." The laughter lingered, echoing into the prairie like a memory. But not every day was soft. There were nights Clara cried without sound, her shoulders trembling under the quilt Luke had left at her feet. He never asked why. He just made sure a lantern was always lit outside her door. She caught him once, praying. Luke knelt by the edge of his bed, hands clenched like a child begging not to be left behind. She didn't interrupt. Later, she told him, "You don't strike me as a churchgoer." "I'm not," he admitted. "But when I talk to God out loud, I figure maybe he listens harder." "Do you ask for something?" He looked at her then, really looked. "I ask not to mess this up." She said nothing, but her fingers brushed as lightly as she wheeled past him. One morning, Clara wheeled into the barn without calling out first. She found Luke bent over a saddle, muttering to himself. "I can help," she said. He turned, surprised. "Help with what?" "With that saddle. I used to clean my father's when he was on the circuit." Luke hesitated but then moved aside. She guided her hands across the leather, expertly checking the buckles, tightening straps with quick fingers. For the first time, Luke saw something more than survival in her movements. He saw purpose. "Where'd you learn to do all that?" he asked. "I wasn't always in a chair," she said simply. A beat passed before she added. "Stagecoach flipped. My cousin didn't make it. I did barely." Luke didn't flinch or offer empty words. He simply stood beside her, the silence between them steady and solid. "You know," he said after a while, "folks in town are wondering why I keep you here." Clara snorted. "Let me guess. They think you've lost your mind." He shrugged. "Maybe, but I figure I'd rather lose that than my soul." That evening, as the sky lit up in bruised purples and gold, Clara asked a question that had been burning since the day she arrived. "Why did you take me in?" "Really?" Luke sipped his coffee. "Because I saw a person. Not a burden. Not a joke. Just someone who deserved better." Her eyes welled, but she held the tears in check. "Most folks don't look that close." "I'm not most folks." They sat there until the stars came out, neither needing more words. The space between them had shifted, not into romance, not yet, but into something cleaner, stronger, a beginning. The next morning, Clara found a folded piece of paper beside her breakfast tray. It was a hand-drawn map of the ranch with notations. Herb garden spot, best view of sunrise, ramp to barn here. At the bottom, Luke had scribbled, "If you're staying, might as well make it yours." She pressed the note to her chest and closed her eyes. She wasn't sure if she was healing, but she knew, finally, she was home. The heat came uninvited, carried on a wind that felt foreign even to the hard-baked plains. By late afternoon, the sun hung low and red in the sky like an omen. The air crackled dry. Even the cattle grew uneasy, their hooves stamping nervously, eyes shifting toward the hills, as if they sensed something coming long before men did. Luke Rollins was mending a fence when he caught the first scent of smoke, sharp, acrid, unmistakable. He stood slowly, narrowing his eyes toward the ridge that bordered his northern property. There, across the line of pine and cedar, a ribbon of black rose against the sky like a snake uncoiling from the mountainside. His gut tightened. It wasn't just a brush fire. It was a fast-moving wildfire. By the time he reached the house, Clara was already wheeling herself onto the porch, squinting at the smoke. Her hands trembled slightly on the wheels, but her voice remained steady. "What is it?" "Fire," he said. "Too close." Clara didn't flinch. "What do you need me to do?" Luke blinked. For a moment, the absurdity of the question startled him. She couldn't run, couldn't climb or lift, but there was no fear in her voice, only readiness. "Just stay inside. I'll get the livestock to the low field, then head toward town. They'll need every hand they can get." She nodded. "Take Bluebell first. She's too wild to lead last." Luke gave a half-smile. Even now, she remembered the animals better than he did. Within minutes, he was gone, riding hard across the pasture with 3 horses in tow and his dog barking at his heels. The smoke thickened behind him, and Clara watched from the window until he vanished into the blur of dust and sky. The ranch grew eerily quiet after that. The wind was stronger now, and with it came flecks of ash. They danced through the air like black snow, landing on the porch, the windowsills, and the edges of Clara's shawl. She closed all the windows, wet towels, and stuffed them into the cracks under the doors, just as she remembered her father doing once long ago. But it wasn't enough. The fire had changed direction. She could feel it now. Not just the threat, but the heat itself, pulsing from beyond the hills like a living thing. Then came the sound that turned her blood to ice, the panicked scream of a horse. Clara turned toward the barn and saw smoke curling from its roofline. A branch, likely blown from a nearby tree, had landed on the awning, still smoldering. Inside, she knew, were Luke's prized colts, too young to be moved earlier, and penned up to avoid trampling. Her breath caught in her throat. Logic screamed at her to wait, to stay, to let Luke handle it. But something deeper stirred inside her, something ancient and defiant. She would not sit idle while lives burned. Clara wheeled out to the porch, where Luke had left a canvas-covered cart with leather reins. Normally, it was used to haul hay, but today it would be her chariot. She tied her shawl around her nose and mouth, pushed herself off the porch, and dragged her body into the cart. It took every ounce of strength she had. She grunted through clenched teeth, pain screaming in her shoulders as she hoisted her legs up with her arms and positioned herself behind the reins. "Come on, Daisy," she whispered, clicking her tongue. The mare, calm, older, stepped forward obediently. Clara steered toward the barn. Inside, the air was thick with smoke. The young horses thrashed in their stalls, terrified. Clara backed the cart close, then reached down with a rope, teeth clenched as she looped it around the gate latch. With a hard yank, she released the stall door. One by one, the colts charged into the cart's open frame, lured by fear more than guidance. Clara threw her body forward, blocking their retreat. Her arms braced against the cart's rim as Daisy pulled them out. The barn creaked ominously behind her, and just as they reached the pasture gate, a section of the roof collapsed in flames. A boy from the neighboring farm, no older than 10, had been watching from the ridge and ran down as Clara emerged. "Ma'am," he cried, You saved him." Clara collapsed sideways in the cart, coughing hard, hair singed at the ends. "Get the sheriff," she rasped, "and tell him Luke's horses are safe." Luke returned just after dusk, sweat pouring down his neck, soot covering his shirt. The fire was contained near the riverbend thanks to help from town, but not before it had scorched 4 properties. His hands shook as he reached the gate, unsure what ruin he would find. What he saw instead stopped him cold. The colts were grazing safely in the pasture. The barn was charred, but still standing. The cart sat empty under the tree. And Clara was resting against the porch post, a damp cloth over her forehead, her eyes closed in exhaustion. Cole Madden stepped out from the house. "She saved him," the sheriff said quietly. "All of them. Drove straight into that smoke like she had legs made of iron." Luke couldn't speak. He approached Clara, knelt beside her, took her soot-blackened hand into his own. When her eyes fluttered open, she smiled weakly. "Don't say anything dumb," she whispered, "like calling me a hero." He laughed, a low, broken sound. "I was gonna say you're the strongest person I've ever met." She squeezed his hand. "Then I'll allow it." The silence that followed was thick with something unspoken, a reverence, perhaps, or the awe of 2 souls finally seeing each other in full. Later that night, Luke sat on the edge of Clara's bed, hat in his lap. His voice was soft but steady. "I don't know what this is, Clara, what we are, but I know you've changed me, and I'd be a fool not to tell you. I'd be proud to walk beside you, if you'd have me." Clara didn't answer right away. She looked toward the window, where the last embers of fire glowed on the horizon. Then, with tears pooling in her eyes, she turned back to him and said, "You didn't save me, Luke. You saw me when no one else did. That's more than saving. That's love." He leaned forward, forehead resting against hers, and the moment held, quiet and infinite. The smoke had cleared, but its memory still clung to the air like a story, waiting to be retold. Whispering Pines had survived the wildfire, though not without scars. Blackened trees stood as grave markers on the ridge. Ash settled in the creek beds, but amid the soot and silence, something new had begun to bloom. At the center of it stood the Rollins ranch, rebuilt, repurposed, reborn. And at the heart of it all was Clara. It started with small visits. A curious child from town, drawn by stories of the brave woman in the cart. Then a pair of ranch wives, shy but persistent, asking Clara how she taught herself to cook without standing. Before long, more came. Women with burdens, children with questions, men with apologies they hadn't known how to say. Luke had suggested adding benches to the barn, unsure what Clara might want to do with the growing attention. "I used to teach," she said simply. "Maybe I still can." So she did. Using salvaged timber, Luke and Cole built a sloped platform at the front of the barn. Clara sat at the head of it in her wheeled chair, leading lessons by day, sharing wisdom by night. They called it the Rollins reading room, though it was far more than books. She taught math and geography, writing and music, but also courage, compassion, and resilience. Lessons no textbook could carry. "She don't need legs," one child whispered. "She's got wings instead." And the town began to change. The same people who once mocked Luke now nodded respectfully when he walked by. The same women who once crossed the street to avoid Clara now brought her fresh-baked bread, patterns for curtains, and sometimes just their stories. There was a strength in Clara they had never noticed because they had never looked. Luke watched it all unfold with a quiet pride. He wasn't a man of many words, but when he stood at the edge of the reading room and saw Clara, surrounded by children laughing and learning, something in him healed. The loneliness that had once weighed down his shoulders like saddlebags full of stones gone, replaced by something lighter, stronger. He had once believed his life had ended in fire and war, but now he knew it had simply paused, waiting for the right hands to shape the ashes into something beautiful. By summer's end, the Rollins ranch was no longer just a patch of land. It was a place of hope. Parents rode in from miles around to ask if Clara could teach their children. Luke expanded the corral to accommodate visitors. Cole helped draft a charter to formally recognize the school. They named it the Clara Rollins School for All. When the sign was unveiled, Clara stared at the carved letters for a long time. Then she turned to Luke, her voice unsteady. "I never thought I'd be more than what they saw." He touched her hand gently. "You were always more. They just finally caught up." One crisp morning in early October, Luke and Clara stood before the congregation at the small chapel near town. The same townsfolk who once laughed behind their backs now filled the pews, silent and reverent. Clara wore a pale blue dress, handmade by the women who had once pitied her. Her chair was decorated in fresh wildflowers. Luke stood beside her in his best coat, stiff with newness, but softened by the warmth in his eyes. Cole officiated the ceremony. "Some love stories start with a spark," he said. "This one began with smoke, but found fire in the hearts of two souls who refused to be burned down." When Luke lifted Clara's veil, he paused, not from nerves, but reverence. He kissed her like she was made of both glass and iron. And when the congregation erupted in cheers, Clara laughed, a full, vibrant laugh that seemed to echo all the way to the plains. Life didn't become perfect overnight. There were still struggles. Clara sometimes awoke in pain. Luke still bore the weight of his past, but they bore it together. The ranch remained a working property. Cattle were raised, horses trained, and every afternoon, after lessons, Luke and Clara sat on the porch as the sun dipped low, sipping sweet tea and trading stories like campfire embers. One evening, as the wind rustled through the tall prairie grass, a young girl, no more than 6, approached the porch steps. "Mama," she asked, "how did you ride through fire?" Clara looked at her, golden hair, curious eyes, the child she and Luke had adopted just months earlier. She smiled, wheeled herself forward, and said, "I didn't ride through it, sweetheart. I became the fire." The girl blinked, amazed. "Can I become fire too?" Clara reached down, pulled her into her lap, and whispered, "You already are." Luke watched them both, hand resting on Clara's shoulder, the light of the sunset casting them in golden hues. As the seasons turned, so did the legend. Whispering Pines told the story of the lonely cowboy who was mocked with a broken bride, but made her the pride of the plains. Travelers came to see the school. Reporters wrote about the woman who taught from a chair, but stood taller than any man in town. The tale passed from lips to paper, from paper to hearts. But to Luke and Clara, the story wasn't about pity, or heroism, or even triumph. It was about two people who refused to be defined by what they had lost, and instead built something from what remained. Love, respect, purpose, and fire.